Let's start storing data about the user, whether the user is authenticated, and so on. And for that, I think it makes sense to start off by creating a user model. So in the auth folder, I'll add a new user.model.typescript file. And the idea here is that this model stores all the core data that makes up a user and even helps us with validating whether that token is still valid. Because remember, I said that the token would expire after 1 hour, and we'll need to therefore also find out not only if a token exists, but if it is still valid. And I want to manage this in this model. Therefore, I'll export a class here with a name of user, which I guess is a fitting name for, well, a user model. And in there, we can use a constructor so that we can create a user with the new keyword. And there, again, I'll use the TypeScript shortcut of automatically storing arguments of the constructor in properties of the class by adding an accessor in front of the property name, in front of the argument name, which will then also be used as the property name. And there, a user should have an email, which is of type string. A user also should have an ID, which is of type string. And we need that token. And this I will store as a private property underscore token, which is a string. And also a token expiration date, which should be a private property underscore token expiration date, which will be a date object, so of type date. Now, why underscore and why private? Private because the token should not be retrievable like this. Instead, when the user, or you as a developer, want to get access to the token, you should actually be required to do that in a way that will automatically check the validity. And this can be achieved by adding a getter here with the get keyword, which I'll name token now. Now, what is a getter? A getter here looks like a function. We add parentheses and then a function body, but you actually access it like a property. So you will be able to do something like user.token. This is how you will be able to access this. Because it's a getter, it's a special type of property, you could say. It's a property where you can write code that runs when you try to access this property. So it's a property plus, you could say. A getter also means that the user can't override this. So setting user token to something new, this will throw an error because it's only a getter, not a setter. There are setters too, but we don't need them here. You set a token when you create a new user object, and we will always create a new user object when a user logs in. So therefore, we have that getter named token, and the idea here is that we, of course, return this underscore token here, but before we do that, we can add certain checks. Or to be precise, I want to add one check. I want to check if this token expiration date does not exist, so if this does not exist, or if the current date, which we get with new date, that's a JavaScript feature, that's the current timestamp, not just the date, but also the current time. If the current timestamp is greater than this token expiration date, so if it does exist, but it is smaller than the current timestamp, then we know that the token expired, right? Because if the token expiration date is smaller than the current date, then it's in the past, and that means even if we have a token, it's not valid anymore. And therefore, in that case, I will return null, even though we might have a token. That's the logic I want to add in this user object for now, or in that user class for now. With that created, in the auth service, I want to store the authenticated user, and I will actually store it as a subject. So for that, let's add a user subject with new subject. The subject here is, of course, imported from RxJS. And this will be a generic type where we store the user in the subject in the end. So the user needs to be imported from the user model. And now with that, the idea, of course, is that we emit a new user. We next a new user whenever we have one, we log in, or also when we log out, when we clear the user, when the user becomes invalid or the token expired. So now here, for example, for signing up, we know that when we succeed, if we don't have an error, we get the auth response data, which contains that token we need for the user, which contains the email and the expiry date. And therefore, I want to add a new operator, a new RxJS operator to that pipe here, to that observable pipe. This will be the tab operator. Now the tab operator, just like catch error, needs to be imported from RxJS operators. And if you remember, tab was an operator that allows us to perform some action without changing the response. So it steps into that observable chain, but it doesn't stop it, block it, or change it. It just runs some code with the data you get back from the observable. So with the response in this case. Therefore, here we get our response data. And here I then want to create my new user. For that, I'll create a new constant user where I call new user using that user model. And we need to forward that email because we expect that as our argument here in the constructor. We need to forward the ID, which is the REST data local ID. That's the generated user ID generated by Firebase. We need to forward the token, which is our ID token. And we need the expiration date, which should be a date object. Now that's not part of our response. That is something we have to generate. And for that, I'll add a new constant here, expiration date, where I create a new JavaScript date object based on that expires in time we get back from Firebase. Now, expires in, if you check the Firebase docs here, is a string, but in the end, it holds a number, the number of seconds until the ID token expires. So therefore here, all we have to do is we have to get the current date, and on that, we can call getTime. That's the current timestamp in milliseconds since the beginning of time, which in JavaScript was in 1970. So we have the current timestamp in milliseconds, and to that, we add REST data expires in, which we have to convert to a number by adding an extra plus in front of it. So we add REST data expires in times 1000. Because expires in, that is in seconds. This is the timestamp in milliseconds. Here, therefore, we need to multiply the seconds with 1000 to convert this to milliseconds as well. And this gives us the expiration date in milliseconds. And by wrapping this with new date, as I'm doing it, this will convert it back to a date object, which is a concrete timestamp in a date object form and not in milliseconds anymore. So this is the expiration date, which we now can pass as a fourth argument here to that user constructor. Here it is. So this constructs the user with the data we get back from the backend and with our expiration date. Now we can use the subject to next that user. So to set this or emit this as our now currently logged in user in this application. Now, just as before with the error handling, we need the exact same logic for logging users in. And therefore we can use the same approach as for the error handling. I'll add a new private method, handle authentication or whatever you want to name it. And there I expect to get the email. I expect to get the token. I expect to get expires in, let's say, as a number. And now we can grab that code we just wrote here in tab and move that here into handle authentication. Now use expires in, which is not coming from response data and which does not have to be converted to a number because we already expect it as a number. Use the email here. We also need the user ID, so let's expect that as a string as well. So use the user ID here and also use the token here. Now we have handle authentication that would do everything we need related to authentication. Here in tab, when we get the response data, we now just have to call this handle authentication and forward REST data email, REST data local ID, REST data expires in as a number. So let's add a plus in front of that. And before we add this, we also need REST data token, ID token, excuse me. So we basically call handle authentication with all the data this function needs. And now we can just copy that tab operator here and move it into the pipe for our login route. So that there, we now also call this handle authentication. We forward all that data. And in here, in handle authentication, we then use that data to create a new user and log the user in. Now, that's creating the user, that's logging us in. The next step, of course, will be to also redirect the user in the user interface and navigate us away and also to then update the UI and, for example, show a logout button in our header and only show the manage buttons here if we are logged in. So update the entire header based on the auth status, and as I just said, forward us when we do log in.